I'd like now to invite to the podium Most Reverend Jeffrey Haynes, Auxiliary Bishop of Milwaukee, who will offer us a welcome from the Archdiocese.
I'm here on behalf of Archbishop Jerome II and also the 600,000 Catholics of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. And I'd like to welcome you all to this 2022 Catholic Immigrant Integration Initiative Conference. Unfortunately, Archbishop Listecki cannot be with us, but he sends his blessing. He currently is at a meeting of the Executive Committee of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. They're meeting in Washington, D.C. That's the group that sets the agenda for the fall meeting in November. That's going to take place in Baltimore. I'm very pleased to be with you today, and for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm a proud graduate of Marquette University, and I'm very happy that my alma mater is able to host this important conference. Second, it's a pastoral priority of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee that there be a coordinated Catholic response to the issues in our communities. This heightens my appreciation for the work of this Catholic Immigrant Integration Initiative, because it seeks to connect many different Catholic institutions, programs, ministries, and leaders that work with immigrants and refugees in order that we as a church may better serve the call of the gospel to welcome the stranger. I'm most pleased that you are here because your work is an important witness to the both and response that is crucial in all of our Catholic social responsibilities. I know that there are many people taking part in this conference, both present here now and also virtually, who work directly with immigrants and refugees to assist them as they seek to support their families. But I know that there are others in this ministry who advocate for dignified and fair reforms in immigration and refugee laws. The history of most Catholic families in the United States, including my own, is one of migration. Although America has aspired to welcome the tired, the poor, the huddled masses of the world, we have also produced know-nothing parties and have often sought to exclude people because of their race and ethnicity. God calls us to recognize, as we hear in the readings, Mass today, and as a church, that we are to be part of one body. All of you here help us do this, both as individual believers and as a church. I thank you very much for your important work, and my prayer is that the next days are going to be very inspiring and very helpful for you. Again, welcome to the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, and would like to provide you with a blessing on you and your work. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit descend upon you and remain with you forever. Thank you.
I am very happy to invite to the podium now Fatima Jimenez Gonzalez, a student in the College of Education. She's a junior. She's studying middle and secondary education in Spanish. She's a member of St. Patrick's Parish on the south side, part of the class of 2024. So, Fatima.
Good morning. Thank you for being here today, whether that is in person or for those of you listening virtually. It means so much to me to see all of you gathered here today to discuss a topic and enhance your knowledge on something that directly affects my everyday life and the life of thousands across the country. Like Father McNulty mentioned, my name is Fatima Jimenez Gonzalez, a first-generation student here at Marquette, and I am pursuing a teaching degree. I am one of 8 children in my family, 5 of which of us are immigrants. And I'm here today to share a little bit of my story and kind of shine a light on the reality of life for us immigrants here in the US. So my family and I immigrated from Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico in 2003, when I was just under the age of 2. Like many others, we were seeking a better life. For us, that meant a well-rounded education, safety, better job opportunities, financial stability, and a chance of creating our own vision for the future. I truly was too young to remember anything from my homeland and really hold any emotional attachment. But from the various stories I have heard from my parents, my siblings, and other family members, I know immigrating here was not an easy task. My parents left their home country with nothing. They left with empty hands, but hearts full of hope that something would come, and they were prepared to do anything for their children. The one thing that they did take with them, the most important thing I would say, was their faith. Both of my parents grew up Catholic. Their families were remarkably devoted as members of the church. And my parents held on to that religion as an essential component of their life and a factor in their marriage, eventually bestowing it upon us as their children. And they carried with them that faith, especially in their journey to Milwaukee, that really long, exceedingly painful, and devastating journey. Here, we were able to find a community that took us in, that offered us resources, and placed us in a sanctuary that cared for us. The Catholic Church and its community, for us being Our Lady of Guadalupe and St. Patrick's congregation in the south side of the city, became our first home away from home. Which brings me to the main question I'm here to answer today. How have Catholic organizations in the city helped me in my journey as an immigrant in the US? The answer is quite simple. How haven't they? The church quite literally became our home. A wonderful and caring priest was able to grant us a place to live when my family was struggling and at a breaking point during the 2008 recession, and after countless years of trying to build a stable life for ourselves. It was because of the generosity of this priest that we were able to thrive. That same congregation gave my parents job opportunities to help them support their children. For me, it provided me with meaningful activities, such as church choir. My old church choir is actually here, teacher is actually here today. And there I was able to discover my love for music and being able to form lifelong friendships. Other activities such as summer camp, where I eventually had opportunities to explore my abilities as a leader and as a teacher. Other organizations like Catholic Charities in Milwaukee helped my siblings and I receive legal advice and guidance when it came time to explore our options. Luckily for us, learning how to go through the DACA process, and they were at very or substantially low cost, which otherwise we wouldn't have been able to afford. Casa Romero Renewal Center has also played an important part of my life. First, providing me with heartfelt retreats in middle school, where I was able to learn more about myself emotionally and spiritually. Later, allowing me to develop my leadership skills as one of their members, facilitating those same retreats. Additionally, it fostered my first work and volunteer experiences, opening doors that I never thought could be open for someone in my situation. Most importantly, it was a place where I discovered my passion for working with Milwaukee's youth. Lastly, my siblings and I had the privilege of attending different Catholic institutions in the area, from Notre Dame Middle School and Nativity Jesuit Academy to Marquette University High School, Divine Savior Holy Angels High School, and St. Thomas More High School. Eventually, these schools offered us the education needed to reach our goal of attending college. While we were able to open many doors for ourselves because of the education that we received, our legal status shut many of them quickly. It was really hard to find a college that would be able to support us despite not being able to receive financial aid from the government or take out loans. Fortunately, Catholic and Jesuit institutions like Marquette University and Cardinal Stritch University took us in and offered us the financial support needed to fulfill our dreams despite our legal status. My point in saying all of this is to demonstrate the importance of Catholic organizations in the city of Milwaukee, for people like me and my family, and for our immigrant communities in general. We need more programs like this, who will advocate for us, who can offer us resources and help, who can guide us towards a path that we might not know have even existed, and who can lend us a helping hand. Most importantly, to an organization who understand that for many of us, this is the only home we've ever known. So I want to extend a huge thank you to all of you for all the work that you do. Thank you for accepting us when, despite feeling at home, we are constantly being rejected and reminded that people do not want us here. I strongly believe that if it weren't for the organizations and communities from the Catholic institutions, I do not think that I would be able to be standing here today, despite the challenges I have and will continue to face, with the confidence of knowing that I will persevere and I will succeed at anything I set my mind to. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima, for that inspiration. Our final speaker in this session will be Don Kerwin, Executive Director of the Center for Migration Studies, who will tell us something about the conference.
Well, let me start by just thanking Marquette University and the Archdiocese also for hosting us. It's been a great kind of planning exercise, particularly with the Center for Peacemaking, and we're very grateful to Michael and to Chris and the whole team here. Wanted to thank too the Sisters of Mercy and the Cabrini Mission Foundation who have sponsored this event, and to the members of our advisory group who guided us in developing the agenda, and many of them are kind of speakers over the next 2 days. And yesterday we had these terrific visits at a number of those Catholic institutions that Fatima was talking about, the 16th Street Community Health Centers, St. Anthony's School, and Casa Romero. Some of those folks are here today, and we thank you for hosting us and for kind of the inspirational work that you're doing here in Milwaukee. CMS coordinates and it organizes this event every year, but we started this process and we've been able to continue it over the years. We're just a small think tank, Catholic think tank on migration, in partnership with a number of national Catholic agencies and of course local partner agencies as well in the places that host it. The event now also has kind of this international audience who will mostly of course be joining us remotely. That said, I wanted to recognize one person who's here from Geneva in person, and that's Father Bob Vitilla, who's come a very, very long way and is he's sitting at that table right there. Bob is the Secretary General of the International Catholic Migration Commission, and he's also a Marquette graduate. So when we asked him to come, he said, of course, that's where I went to school. I'm definitely coming. So what about the goal of the Catholic Immigrant Integration Initiative? We call it I don't know, we came up with that name about 10 years ago, and it's not a great name because we're not just talking about integration, we're talking about protection and empowerment and all of those other things as well. But it's now a name and it has an acronym too, which is unfortunate, which is CIII. But the whole goal of CIII is to strengthen the individual and collective work of Catholic institutions that work with immigrants and all sorts of different kinds of institutions. I was with the Catholic Legal Immigration Network for many years, and I had never come to a conference like this before. I didn't know what hospitals were doing. I didn't know what charities were doing, parishes were doing, ministerial organizations were doing, universities with immigrants. And this has been the process that's taught me all that. And I think it's taught a lot of people kind of what the church is doing as a whole. Probably the best kind of instructor on something like that is Fatima, though, who's kind of accessed and used and benefited from those programs. We, to kind of do this work properly, as a church, I think we have to understand what each other are doing. And that's a very tall task, given how siloed the Catholic institutions are and how much it is. that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is that we need to remember our Catholic touchstones. That's a key kind of ingredient. It's kind of the common ground for all of us. And thus what we try to do in all of these gatherings is we try to lift up Catholic teaching and what we also call Catholic learning, actually, what we're learning as we go along as well. And Catholic teaching on immigrant integration and empowerment and protection has a few themes. One is building on the contributions and the leadership of immigrants. Another is seeking communion between persons from diverse cultures. Not just a normal kind of social scientist integration, but communion, a deep bond between people. Another is promoting the common good, which are the conditions that of living that ought to be available to everyone to live a fully human life. So the common good, promoting integral human development, which speaks to the good of all and each and all of their dimensions, including their spiritual dimensions. The notion of evangelizing cultures, which is the role of the church, and not just immigrant cultures, but native cultures too, immigrants, natives, different groups, in order to create a better culture, a more life-giving culture, a new community in light of the gospel. And then also modeling and openness and hospitality in our own Catholic institutions. That's vitally important. We have to kind of walk the walk if we're gonna do our jobs well. The teaching also requires that we consider signs of the times. That is globalization, forced displacement, climate change, rapidly changing labor conditions, the exclusionary nationalism that's growing in our country and around the world, pandemics, racial injustice, all of these issues. And actually the event is going to cover all of those challenges in different ways as well. And we try to break down institutional silos and consider the needs of immigrants holistically. A regular theme of these events, and a highlight of this one, is the overarching need for youth and young adults to take leadership roles in Catholic institutions. That's pretty much the whole game for the church and the future of the church and its work with immigrants is that. And we also ask some very hard questions, I think. One is, do our current Catholic structures reflect the Catholic Church's historic identity as a church of immigrants? Do our signature institutions, basically all of which were created by or for immigrants from earlier eras, do they meet the needs of today's immigrants? Are we successfully wedding our values, knowledge, service provision, and advocacy? We talk about that a lot, but is it really happening on the ground? Are we individually doing what we should be doing in light of these external and external challenges? Our agenda over the next 2 days, it's really an embarrassment of riches. And I've got to say that as I look around and see people come in, it's a lot of you all are my personal heroes and have been for a long, long period of time. So it's great to see so many good people together. I am going to be extremely disappointed not to be able to attend all of these various sessions, but they will be videoed and they will be available to people. So please do go back and watch them. Instead of going over the agenda, of course, you can look at that yourself, but it's incredible, right? International borders, immigrant integration in the Midwest, the root causes of migration, how do you create immigrant-friendly parishes, how research can assist in accompanying immigrants and serving immigrants, the great work of the Catholic Church at the UN on these issues, building legal capacity for immigrants, and not just in Catholic Charities programs, but in non-traditional places. Laudato Si, and this important initiative led by Father Bob at ICMC, that links migration, health, the future of work, healthcare, and all of these other issues, and the environmental issues as well. It's a really crucial initiative that I hope you're all interested in. We learn a lot about. The Father Lidio Tomasi theological lecture that Father Daniel Grudy is going to deliver tomorrow. The best practices of serving immigrant students, what COVID-19 taught us about the work that we do. Fostering young adult leadership and formation in Catholic institutions, the work of university students and peacemaking initiatives, building a whole of church response to the multiple displacement crises that are in the news, fostering Catholic leaders based on Catholic teaching, not based on what they see on television, but on Catholic teaching. That's a huge challenge for us. Forming Catholic, honoring the legacy of two great saints on immigrants, Mother Cabrini and Bishop Scalabrini, who's going to be canonized on October 9th. So we're very excited about that because we ourselves are a Scalabrini institution. And the church's work in restoring and rebuilding the U.S. refugee and legal immigration systems, which were badly depleted, as we know, by the last administration that will go unnamed. So the event is going to end sometime tomorrow with a reception, and that's going to include poetry and musical performances and a celebration. So what's not to like about an event like this, right? And we're very glad to have you all here. Let me stop there and thank you all again for being with us, and thank all the organizers and all the people that, you know, provided so much inspiration and have over the years. Our first panel, which I don't think is going to start until 10 o'clock, is on racism and U.S. immigration policy and practice. Bishop Seitz was going to join us, but he's actually recovering from an illness, so he's not going to be here in person, but he'll be joining us remotely. So any announcements? We're good? So thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to let you all know, as Don said, the next session is going to begin at 10 a.m. We will have a Q&A at the end. So there's going to be a microphone over here at this podium. So towards the end of the session, feel free to come up to it and ask your questions, and the moderator will signal when to start. So I guess if you'd like to take a break, go ahead now, and we'll begin the next session at 10 a.m.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this opening plenary session of the Catholic Immigrant and Integration Initiative. Welcome to all of you who are in the room and everyone who is joining us remotely. A special welcome to our panelists, who I will introduce shortly. Thank you all for being with us. My name is Joan Neal, and I am the Deputy Executive Director and Chief Equity Officer at Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice, and I am honored to serve as your moderator for this discussion. Our topic this morning is racism in U.S. immigration policy and practice, a Catholic response. I'm pleased to be joined this morning by three people who know a lot about this issue and are experts in their various spheres of work. Bishop Mark Seitz, Bishop of the Diocese of San Jose, Texas. Kathleen Kim, attorney and Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion at Loyola Marymount University, Los Angeles, California. And Renette Asserwak, Director of Government Relations at Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice and lead lobbyist on our immigration work in Washington, D.C. I will introduce each of our panelists more fully as they offer their presentations on the panel. Following their input, I will ask each of them to respond to two questions that allow a little more elaboration on our topic, and then we will open up the session for your questions and comments. I will then wrap up with some closing comments. So let's get started. It's my observation that when many people think about the U.S. immigration system, policies, and on-the-ground realities, racism might not be the first thing that comes to mind. Most people would likely say that anti-immigrant sentiment stems only from the fact that some immigrants choose to enter our country illegally, not by following the rules that they say that their ancestors had to comply with in order to enter the country. Some people say those people who are crossing our borders without papers are illegal. And yet, we know, if you study U.S. history, the truth is that racism has played a central part in our immigration system almost from the very beginning. It has been systematized and institutionalized such that we, all of us here, do not even know an immigration system without racism. It is alive and at work even today. So our panel this morning will discuss the continuing role of racism in anti-immigrant rhetoric, public policies, and on-the-ground practices across the country. We will explore racism as a barrier to the reform of the immigration system. And we will discuss the need for Catholics and Catholic institutions to address racism in their advocacy, mission, and organizations. So let's begin with Bishop Mark Seitz, who Pope Francis appointed the 6th Bishop of the Diocese of El Paso, Texas, one of the epicenters of our current immigration quagmire. Bishop Seitz, who holds 3 master's degrees in divinity, theology, and liturgical studies, was recently elected chairman-elect of the Committee on Migration and Refugee Services for the USCCB. His appointment takes effect this November. Serving in this border community, he has focused his work and heart on those who are poor and vulnerable, including migrant families and refugees who have made their home in this region. Bishop Seitz believes migrants add tremendous value to the communities where they choose to live, and that parishes and community members should welcome them with compassion, love, and solidarity. In response to the terrible racist shooting at the El Paso Walmart in 2020, Bishop Seitz wrote a moving pastoral letter entitled "Night Will Be No More" that names racism as a root cause of anti-immigrant sentiment. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it. As he leads his diocese, Bishop Seitz has much to teach us all about how racism influences immigrant ideologies and what a truly Catholic response to the issue might be in dioceses across the country. Bishop Mark Seitz.
Thank you very much, Joan. Thanks for your kind introduction. At first, you had me worried a little bit that someone hadn't told me about my transfer to San Jose, but no, I'm still here in El Paso.
Sorry, did I say San Jose? Sorry.
That's all right. Thank you very much to my fellow panelists also, Mr. Siratham and Dr. Kim. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. When I think about my pastoral letter on racism, I think it's important for anyone in leadership to recognize that there are going to be times in life when you're confronted by events beyond your control and which test you. The 2019 shooting was one of those moments for me. It was an act unthinkable of racial terrorism, targeting our people, their culture, their binational identity, their spirit of welcome. As a religious leader, your job in moments like this is to open up a space to God somewhere in the middle of all this, to comfort people and to try to make some sense of what happened. In a sense, the victims of that massacre went beyond just the 23 dead and an equal number who died, who were injured. It extended to the families, and the ripple effects extended to the whole community. And if it was meant to terrorize, that it did. People in El Paso told me how for the first time they felt afraid to walk outside the door because of the target they felt on their back, because they were Latino. As a pastor, you have to speak to this. So my letter was a love letter to my people, an attempt to begin to interpret what happened in the light of the gospel. But once you begin untangling all the knots, you realize just how thoroughly racism is baked into the life of the border. It has a history. I was from Wisconsin, just about 30 miles west, actually, of where you are meeting. And when I grew up, I was kind of oblivious to this history. But when you're confronted with something like August 3rd, you begin to look differently at the underside of our history. You see how extensive it is, how horrific it is, how death dealing it is. And so I felt it was important to put what happened into context, because unless you name it, you can't deal with it. And what happened wasn't isolated from a border political context. We've all seen over the last several years just an eruption of hatred and scapegoating and hateful speech. And this is important. It was politically legitimated. The murders in El Paso were directly connected to that. And I felt an obligation to point that out. We were told the lie that we need to be afraid of those who are different. Now, what I tried to show in my pastoral letter is that this racism is manufactured in service of privilege, gain, and social superiority. Racism has no real foundation. Scientifically, we know it's all based on a lie, but it's sold over and over again, and often by politicians. And so this type of violence happens again and again in our history. And it shapes our laws, including immigration law and how we enforce immigration law. Many of you are familiar with what people face when they come to the border. I've been in El Paso now for 9 years. I've seen how trauma can affect families. I've talked to those who have been returned to Mexico and those who've been in the hieleras, the ice cold rooms where they are kept in detention. I've listened to kids who've had to make it through the desert alone. I've been at the morgue when bodies are taken from the Rio Grande. I've celebrated memorial masses for those who didn't make it. But remember, all this has a history. There's a story from all the way back in 1917 that I think teases this out. You may know the story of Rosa Parks, but I wonder if you know the story of Carmelita Torres. This image that you're seeing right now is from the artist Frank Parga. Back in 1917, there was this young woman from Ciudad Juarez, a 17-year-old domestic worker who used to cross the border from Juarez to El Paso on a streetcar every day to go to work. Now, at the time, there was a new mayor in El Paso, Tom Lee, an Anglo, a progressive who promised to clean up corruption, but who started tearing down the housing of the poor and the immigrants in the city center. And he also wanted to address the issue of so-called dirty Mexicans crossing the border, a trope we've heard over and over. He whipped up fears about typhus fever, which even the public health authorities thought was beyond the pale. But local customs officials implemented a delousing campaign anyway, forcing them to undress, dousing Mexicans with gasoline. Now the customs officials would often take photos of the women through peepholes as they undressed. And less than a year before the same tactic of delousing was used on 28 prisoners in the El Paso jail, and it resulted in a fire, killing them all. So one day, Carmelita just said no. She wouldn't get off the streetcar. She wouldn't submit to the indignity. And she was soon joined by dozens and dozens of other young domestic worker women, and they completely shut down the bridge for a couple days. Now, if you think of that story, a lot of our immigration policy today is like that, conceived in racism, driven by a politics of fear. It sounds a lot, for instance, like Title 42, another anti-immigrant policy directed now against the most vulnerable asylum seekers with no basis in public health. But it's not just Tom Lee's delousing campaign. It's the Asian Exclusion Acts of 1924, Operation Wetback in 1954, the border wall and increased enforcement, the blockade strategies, Operation Streamline, remain in Mexico, the charging of Haitian fathers at the Texas border. At the border, we've seen it all. It's the same thing over and over again. It's racism. These last several years have been a really rocky time of racial reckoning. Hopefully, it's harder to close our eyes to how pervasive racism and supremacy have been and are. In the opening lines of my letter, I call racism an idol. In Christianity, an idol is something that competes with God for our devotion. It's something other than God that we cling to for comfort and security. And we've clung to racism. We just can't seem to shake it. There's a moment in the book of Exodus, in the 32nd chapter, when Moses comes down from talking with God on the mountain and finds his people engaged in idol worship, the golden calf. And he can't deal with it. Enraged, he takes the 2 tablets of the covenant, the ones that God has just inscribed by his own finger, and he smashes them. I think you could say that today we're living through a period of smashed tablets. As a country, we've lost confidence that the law can and should be just. We've lost trust in any shared cultural and social inheritance and in one another. And we know we've given over our devotion to profit, to money making and security at the expense of human dignity. And the trouble is, I'm not sure we know exactly what to do about it. And once you transfer your devotion from God and the truth to something else, once you indulge in that kind of vanity, well, anything is possible. Anything is justifiable. Deaths of children in the desert or in the river or in a tractor trailer outside San Antonio become a trifle. This year, 2022, will be the highest year on record for border deaths at this point in the year. They're listed as 557, and that's just from the bodies they've found. How is that possible in 2022? Because once you place your political power above all else, you can overlook anything else. But in better moments, I remember that for all our warts, this is a country that through the grit and agitation and sacrifice of many overcame slavery, gave us the Civil Rights Acts, the Voting Rights Acts, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the Refugee Act of 1980, the various legalizations, imperfect though they've been. It does take a while, but there does seem to be an arc in our history, as MLK said, that bends toward justice. Eventually, Moses regains his footing, goes back up the mountain, and begs God to stay his wrath. We Catholics have a role to play in extending the arc of justice. No one's made that clearer lately than Pope Francis. This is a pope who also clearly sees how migrations, more than ever before, will play a pivotal role in the future of our world. And he sees how immigration status and how borders are some of the great axes of inequality in our time. We need to eradicate the hate that's built up like plaque in our country. We need to get to immigration reform. We need to restore and rebuild asylum and make sure it's respected. We need to restore our relationship with sending communities and with the earth. Pope Francis has given us a great deal to meditate on in Fratelli Tutti, his encyclical on human fraternity. And the heart of the encyclical is the parable of the Good Samaritan. For centuries, During Mass, the church used to pair the telling of the story of the Good Samaritan with references to the story of Moses in Exodus, of Moses pleading that God stay his wrath in the face of idolatry. There's a connection there, which the early church fathers saw. Remember the parable: a priest and a Levite pass by a beaten and wounded man on the side of the road. They represent the law and they pass by. And there's a sense, and this is what the early church fathers saw, that the law, while important, is insufficient, especially at a time when the tablets are smashed and on the ground, especially at a time of polarization and division, when Samaritans and Jews, and today's version of Samaritans and Jews, want nothing to do with one another. By itself, it can't generate neighborliness. What's needed is a conversion of heart, compassion, tenderness, love. That's where the Samaritan comes in. He's the outsider who redefines what it means to be a neighbor. Perhaps it's no coincidence that he is also a foreigner. The fathers saw in the figure of this foreigner Jesus himself, Jesus, the stranger. We don't need Moses to beg God to stay his wrath anymore. In our brokenness, it's God who comes to our rescue, to the rescue of our wounded humanity, shot, beaten, degraded, returned to Mexico, deluded by the idol of racism, duped into fearing one another. And the Samaritan brings the wounded man to the inn and promises to pay the bill so they'll tend to him. St. Augustine saw in this the figure of the church. For the early fathers, the inn was the church, what Francis calls a field hospital. The Pope is clear. He wants the church to be a field hospital, a place of hospitality. Our job is to take care of the wounded on the way, to walk with communities torn apart by hatred. Our place is with those who are beaten and worn down from racism and every other sin, denouncing injustice, painting a picture of what could be, needling the proud, lifting up the injured, announcing the good news, sticking by the poor, the sick, and the immigrant, offering true worship. Remember how Jesus told the Samaritan woman at the well that her people would worship the Father in spirit and in truth. As we read in the book of James, true religion is this: to watch over orphans and widows in their affliction. If the church isn't an inn, if it's not a Samaritan church, not a field hospital, it's not the church. Being the inn, being the field hospital can be deeply renewing for the spiritual life personally. I've tried to live this, even in the wake of August 3rd. It changes you, and it can recenter the pastoral work of the church and our work for a more just society. This type of work is medicine for the soul. It's an off-ramp from the culture wars around us, the polarization and the bickering. And it's the best gift we can offer a wounded body politic, so that we can begin to turn from idolatry, pick up the shards of the covenant, and rebuild. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bishop Sykes, for those insightful and moving comments, and for your brave truth-telling on the issue of racism and how we see it manifest in our relationships with one another, especially in the immigration system. Our next panelist is Kathleen Kim, Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion at Loyola Marymount Law School in Los Angeles, California. Professor Kim is a nationally recognized expert on immigrants' rights and human trafficking. She received her JD from Stanford Law School, where she served a prestigious fellowship and was editor of the Stanford Law Review. Her scholarship examines the 13th Amendment and its relationship to immigration, workplace rights, and civil rights through the intersectional lens of race and gender. Throughout her career, Professor Kim has been a pioneer in legal issues having to do with immigration, immigrants' rights, and anti-trafficking law. She is not only co-author of the Human Trafficking Law and Policy, which is the leading casebook on human trafficking in the country, she is also a faculty advisor to the Loyola Immigrant Justice Clinic, which she helped to co-found with her students, and which has become the primary pro bono immigration service provider for indigent non-citizens in Los Angeles. She currently serves on the advisory board of the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, and continues to provide technical assistance and expert testimony on human trafficking case and policy guidance to governmental and non-governmental groups. Professor Kim will talk to us about her work at the center and her experiences with the way racism is manifest in the lives of the people she serves. Please welcome Professor Kathleen Kim.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Director Neal, and thank you for the moving comments, Bishop Seitz, which provided an appropriate backdrop for what I plan to share with you all today. I would like to share my screen if that's possible. Okay, thank you. So as Ms. Neal indicated, my name is Kathleen Kim. I've taught at LMU Loyola Law School for over 15 years now. During my time at the law school, I've had the benefit of launching several interrelated initiatives. Today, my focus is immigrants' rights and the history of our immigration laws and its inextricable connection to racism, individualized and structural. This is really at the core of my work, and the projects and clinics that I've helped to start at the law school all address different aspects of the historical entrenchment of exclusionary immigration enforcement laws, parallel alongside racist criminal laws and the expansion of those laws to criminalize everyday behavior. And today's manifestations of that history has evolved into an immigration regime that is quite draconian and shockingly draconian. Draconian in the same manner that we as those of us who are informed of the history of our immigration system understand were similar practices from the very first exclusionary immigration laws in 1875. The contemporary manifestations that I'll speak about appear in the community-based work of our Immigrant Justice Clinic, which is located in-house at our law school, but does twice monthly intake clinics at our community partner organizations, Dolores Mission Parish and Homeboy Industries. So that our work through the Immigrant Justice Clinic focuses on addressing the legal needs of indigent non-citizens on the east side of Los Angeles, where which has the highest population of non-citizens that are at or below the poverty line, and also the highest concentration of Los Angeles's undocumented population. And the other related projects that I'll speak a little bit about are two new clinical initiatives at the law school under the auspices of our Anti-Racism Center, LARC. And those two projects are the RISE Clinic, Rights and Systems Enforced, which represents victims of violence, for the vast majority of whom are non-citizens who have been victimized by violence, yet targeted for criminalization and or immigration enforcement. So the RISE Clinic is the first of its kind in the nation and the only law school in the nation to have received a sizable grant from the federal government to provide access to counsel for crime victims of violence. And so we teach our students how to represent those individuals in all enforcement systems, whether immigration enforcement as defendants or criminal enforcement as victim witnesses or victim defendants, because evidence demonstrates that those who are victimized by violence are often, for the most part, have criminal histories of their own because they're often targeted for criminalization over policing. And finally, the newest project that we've started under the auspices of our Anti-Racism Center is our Anti-Trafficking Policy Initiative. And the pillars of that project include racial equity and immigrants' rights. As I said earlier, those two phenomena, or immigration and race, have been inextricably connected. And as the bishop said, since really the beginnings of this country. And that's where I'd like to start, or that's where I'd like to pivot now to. Okay, so as Ms. Neal described earlier, both my work on the ground as a civil rights lawyer before I entered academia, and my continued work while in the not so ivory tower anymore, has been at the intersection of the 13th Amendment and immigrants' rights, workplace rights, and civil rights. Human trafficking has become a large focus of that because the chief federal law that addresses human trafficking is derived from the 13th Amendment, which was the first of the Reconstruction Amendments enacted in 1865 that abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, and also empowered Congress through Section 2 to enact further legislation to eliminate the badges and incidents and vestiges of slavery. So the federal law that has existed now for a little over 20 years, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, is derived from the 13th Amendment and addresses modern manifestations of unfree labor and what's legally called forced labor and human trafficking. That area in particular, both doing work on the ground and representing clients who are survivors of trafficking, and also as a scholar who has the luxury to take a deep dive into the history, it's easy to thread the needle between this country's beginnings and the unfortunate persistence of legal regimes that are complicit in the exploitation of citizens of color. And I'd like to highlight just the period of Reconstruction. So the 13th Amendment, as the first Reconstruction Amendment, stood for a broad principle of anti-race and economic-based subordination. Unfortunately, its promise was cut short by state laws in the southern states called Black Codes that quickly re-enslaved free slaves through threat of criminal penalty and the expansion of lifestyle based crimes like vagrancy, loitering. And under that threat of punishment, newly freed slaves were quickly re-enslaved and then subjected to hard labor. This was a direct backlash to Reconstruction, and Reconstruction was, except for the 1960 Civil Rights Movement, was the first time that the federal government had intervened in state misconduct to the degree that it did. So during Reconstruction, there were federal troops in the southern states trying to enforce Reconstruction. And what that looked like was trying to deter rampant violence against newly freed slaves, Black Americans who then became empowered through the 14th Amendment and then the 15th Amendment to vote in elections. And by 1870, 15% of legislative seats across the country, including the federal government and state and local governments, have been occupied by Black Americans, 15%, and that percentage was never to be gained again. The backlash, the white supremacist backlash against the civic and political engagement of newly freed slaves had its collateral consequences on immigration. There had been no robust immigration system. We lived in a borderless country until 1875. And so 1875 coincides with the end of Reconstruction and the expansion of lifestyle criminal laws. And that first immigration restriction came with the Page Act. And the Page Act was racially non-neutral and prohibited the entry of Chinese and Asian women, other Asian women. The plain text of the statute states Chinese and other Oriental women who are lewd and debauched. And at the time that language presumed that women from Asia came to the United States to engage in prostitution. And so on that basis, the Page Act became federal law, and and also our first immigration law. So our first immigration law was an enforcement tool to deny entry of migrants of color, and the immigration laws that would follow, all the way up until most of them, all the way up until 1965, were just additional exclusionary laws that were either explicitly racist or perhaps neutral on their face, but had explicitly racist legislative histories. For example, the 1929 Undesirable Aliens Act, which was a direct backlash against migrant labor from Mexico. And the legislative history of that act was clearly racist and xenophobic and targeted to exiling and denying entry of Mexican migrant workers. The only opportunities for safe passage of migrants of color came during wartime through War Brides Acts. But even then, the discretion of border officials served to deny entry to those who were legally eligible to enter, but were subjected to border inspection at the border and wide discretion by any border official to deny re-entry and repatriate the immigrant. So in 1965, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. And that was viewed as an enormous achievement because it reversed the racist immigration exclusionary laws that had accumulated by then, and also a racist quota system that that was intended to preserve demographic population in the United States that was high majority European, white European. So after 1965, migration to the United States from countries in the global South and countries not even in the global South, but simply non-citizens of color could finally have legal means of entering the country. But the laws, the immigration system was still entrenched in the history of heavy enforcement and restrictions based on based along race lines. And even after the Immigration Nationality Act was passed, the supposed equal measures enacted to open up borders to migrants of color did not translate to equitable outcomes. And today we see tremendous backlogs from specific countries, including China, countries across Central America, Mexico, Philippines, India, countries that would send non-citizens of color and also the populations of which comprise most of the world. And our US system, because of the absence of any kind of immigration reform and any kind of sensical immigration reform, let alone humanitarian immigration reform, has not occurred. These backlogs persist. And that is a lot, and those backlogs are a primary reason for the phenomenon of our stagnant undocumented population in our country of law-abiding community members who have lived here for years and years without ability to access even visa eligibility for which visas for which they would be eligible. And many of those who are undocumented, actually majority of our undocumented population came to the United States legally and simply overstayed their visas. And once here, because of continuing harsh restrictions on re-entering this country, including felony for illegal, what's called illegal re-entry, the undocumented population has been unable to travel. And that's why among immigrants' rights advocates, the legalization of the undocumented population remains of critical concern. Okay, so finally, I'll close with just some observations in the field. There's a desperate need for access to humanitarian relief for the continuing influx of migrants seeking refuge at the border, and migrants from Central America, from Africa, really from all over the world. Our immigration laws have not caught up, and even the discretionary policies that could be enacted through executive actions have not changed. The bishop also mentioned some things like Title 42. So even the promise of a new administration does not fix our immigration system. And our Immigrant Justice Clinic is seeing the effects of that. Non-citizen community members who are increasingly under surveillance and subjected to enforcement and deportation, removal, and a high volume of cases resulting from migrants who are continually seeking entry into the United States because they're fleeing persecution. Finally, I would like to leave on a, sort of high note, I guess, that and something I always encourage with my students is that all is not lost, even if our lawmakers are not have remained either paralyzed or indifferent to the rights of immigrants in this country and immigrants to this country. Mobilization happens with the people, and law often only changes, as history has shown us, through Reconstruction and civil rights era, through social movements. The immigrants' rights movement is a potent one, and one that most of us in this country sympathize with and support. And I think that we as individuals, as long as we keep pushing for and rallying behind immigrants' rights, I do believe I do have optimism for its positive outcome on lawmakers and politics, and in the end, to lead to progressive humanitarian reforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim, for enlightening us about the history of how our laws have institutionalized and systematized racism in our immigration policies and practices, and how race, whiteness, for instance, has been manipulated to prevent immigrants of color from not only gaining lawful entry, but being able to stay here and to put down roots in our country and build a life where they and their families can not only live, but thrive. So thank you for your work. Our final panelist this afternoon is Renette Asirwatham. Renette is my colleague at Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice and serves as the Director of Government Relations and our lead lobbyist on immigration and appropriations. In this role, she develops and executes strategies to advance Network's agenda on Capitol Hill and with the administration, no matter which administration it might be. Renette holds 2 master's degrees, one from Tufts University's Fletcher School and a master's in international human rights law from the University of Essex in the UK. She came to Network with 10 years of federal legislative and administrative lobbying experience in Washington, D.C., and has worked on many aspects of immigration policy and practice, including asylum, refugees, unaccompanied children, and dreamers. As an experienced lobbyist in the immigration space, Renette has much to share with us about the presence of racism in our U.S. immigration system and policy. She will also talk about the pushback that she and other immigration advocates have experienced from many in the Catholic community for whom immigration is not seen as an opportunity to put the teachings of the gospel and the principles of the Catholic social tradition into practice. As one of the co-founders of CIII, Catholics Against Racism and Immigration, a new coalition with national Catholic groups in DC, she will also offer some thoughts about why this organization is absolutely necessary at this point in time. Renette.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you, everyone. I don't have a PowerPoint, but we will start this conversation. Thank you, both Bishop Seitz and Professor Kim, for your words, and you have set the stage for what I have to expand on. I will be talking about, as Joan said, how I see racism in the work that I do in advocacy in Washington, D.C. And the way I see it is both in the laws, but also in regulations that expand the laws and in the practice. And when I say practice, it is both the practice of the laws, but also the practice of the policymakers, practice of law enforcement, and even the practice of civil society. For an example of practice of policymakers, let me give you just one example. So in the ways the policy was written of the temporary protection status for Haitians versus temporary protection status for Ukrainians. So temporary protected status, TPS, is granted by the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security for eligible foreign-born individuals who are unable to return home safely due to conditions or circumstances preventing their country from adequately handling the return. In the US, the Secretary has nominated or has nominated several countries and several citizens from several countries who cannot go home for this TPS. And it is an ongoing, you can do it at any time. So for Haitians, to renew this temporary protection status in 2020, many Haitian groups, Black, religious, secular, immigration groups, had to advocate for almost a year, and this is simply for a renewal, to get protection for more than 150,000 Haitians who are in this country because Haiti is deemed unsafe. We lobbied, we advocated for more than a year, and then thankfully we did get this announcement that there was TPS. But we still did not see it in the Federal Register, so it just still did not become proper policy till 6 months later. And it took the Haitian Prime Minister to be killed and the entire country to descend into further chaos for this to be made into policy. Well, and so it took all of that effort for this one thing that did, protect a lot of people. But with the Ukrainians, we saw a very different practice. We saw that, within a week or so after the war broke out, there was TPS for Ukrainians. And not only was the speed of getting the policy out, that was not the only difference here. There was another key difference. In the policy that stipulated this protected status for Ukrainians, there was a sentence, there was a clause there that says Ukrainians cannot be deported. And this makes clear sense. This government has declared, the secretary has declared that there is a war going on in Ukraine, it is unsafe for people, and therefore they need to be protected here, and therefore they cannot be deported. Perfect sense. However, in the TPS for Haitians, that sentence was not there. It's still not there, even though we have had this renewal for almost 2 years now. I'm sorry, a year and a half. And because of that, even though Haiti is deemed by the Secretary of Homeland Security to be unsafe for Haitians to return to, and we are protecting them, we are still also deporting them. As of yesterday, more than 25,000 Haitians have been deported by this country, a quarter of them children, to a country that we have deemed unsafe. And the question is why? And let me tell you that this 25,000 Haitians have been deported only since the Biden administration took over. If we put it together, it's much more. But just within these 2 years, 25,000 Haitians to a country that we have deemed unsafe. And the question is why? Why is this, separate policies? And again, it is not that, we don't want Ukrainians to be safe. It's not that we don't want other people to be safe. It is clear that we can do this. We can do immigration the right way if we want to. And that is the Ukrainian model. We just need to expand it to other people. The question of why is this is because of the perception and narrative. When we talk about Ukrainians, immediately was, yes, there's a war going on. Sure, people need support. They need protection. But the reality in some ways is that we have been told that, in all of these laws, it is conditions, but it's also individual It's your individuality. So if you are asking for asylum, it's how you are persecuted, the individual. So at that time, it's like, okay, what about other countries that have war? For example, Afghanistan. And, and this is where you see the difference in the practice again. Ukraine has a war. There is now a policy that will allow Ukrainians to come into the US quickly. Because of this policy at the southern border, we have had almost 10,000 Ukrainians processed in 1 month. Yet we are unable to process 5,000 other immigrants who have been in the Remain in Mexico policy within that same month. There is no big difference in actually how this process happens. There is only a difference in the perceptions that we have of why it should happen. And going back to the question of war, if, for example, there's a war on, people need to be protected, yes, they are welcome. If that is the perception and that is the way that we can make sure that 10,000 Ukrainians have got protection, there is through both law and practice, there's also a way we can do that with Afghans. There is a law, the humanitarian parole law, that has been for Afghans especially. And so the law is there. And here the law is not racist or discriminatory or anything like that. But out of the 8,000 Afghans who have applied for humanitarian parole in the last year, 123 applications, only 123 applications have been processed. And this is not because there is not enough finances for this. This is not enough because there is not enough people for this. This is because clearly there's something else. Clearly, we think we need to scrutinize them more. Their documents need to be checked more. We don't believe them. As much as, when I asked somebody at CBP the other day, like, how is it easier to push through, not push through, to process through Ukrainians rather than any other immigrant? I was told, oh, their documents are easier to process. And I was like, how? Because the language, the written language is not something that it's not in the Latin script. So you can't even read it. It's in the Cyrillic script. You need to there are so less translators than there are for Spanish or Haitian Creole. It's not easy. So why is there a perception that this is easier? And these are sort of the questions that we need to ask ourselves and we need to push through, because while, we see the big issues of racism. We see Del Rio. Next week will be 1 year since the Del Rio, those pictures of where, what Bishop Sites showed us, where we saw the Border Patrol hitting Black people, Haitians as well, Haitians. So that's that's when racism is in your face. But unfortunately, because the narratives and perspectives, there is a hidden racism or a racism that is every day that we normalize. And this is what this type of narrative and perceptions do to us. And I can tell you very clearly how this sort of corrupts our minds, because when we think of the narrative, we have to also think of what does this constant narrative that the immigrant is the other do to us. I can tell you, from an example of myself. I am an immigrant. I sought asylum 10 years ago in the United States. And, in the good old days, those days, 10 years ago, one had to file different papers with the Department of Homeland Security through the fax machine. And even then, during that time, if I would go to the FedEx office, that's the only one of the few places that had a fax machine. And I would ask, oh, can I use your fax machine? And then the FedEx person at the counter would be like, fax machine, who uses that anymore? And then I'll go quiet, because then I have to reveal that, oh, I am, sending this to the DHS because I am an immigrant. And therefore, even I think of myself as something wrong, something bad, as something, as being a criminal, sort of being in criminal activity. And let me tell you, like when I was an asylum seeker before I became a citizen, when I was not a citizen, I was even more law-abiding than I am now. I wouldn't jaywalk, I wouldn't ride my bicycle on the sidewalk because I was so afraid. But even knowing that, even knowing how law-abiding I was, I still thought of myself, just simply because I told the word immigrant, that immigrant equals criminal. And this is how the narrative corrupts our minds and normalizes racism in everyday immigrant practice, immigrant policy, and then the rest of us in our everyday work. Is that the fact that we otherize people who we think are different. And this constant narrative is how we get the narrative then of invasion, which leads to what Bishop Seitz was saying and what happened in El Paso, what happened in Buffalo. So while those are the small examples I'll give of what is the practice here, not just in DC, but everywhere, in our minds especially, and us as individuals. What can we do as people of faith, of individuals, of Catholics? What can we do to change this? And this is where I will talk a little bit about what Network and other Catholic immigrant organizations are trying to do. Joan mentioned an initiative that was co-founded by Network and also the Catholic Legal Immigration Network Clinic, and it's called Catholics Against Racism in Immigration, or CARI. CARI's aim is to build a strong and unified Catholic voices calling out and combating systemic racism in the US immigration system, rooted in the values of Catholic social teaching. The idea and the need for an organized Catholic voice rose out of both Networks and clinics' border advocacy work and recognition that in the current immigration landscape, we truly need to invest in new pathways to influence the government and decision makers, and as well as influence the community to focus on racism and also to eradicate racism. While we hope that this CARI is new, it was launched only this year, and we're going slowly to make it a force. One of the important aspects of this work is that we call to action Catholic organizations to do anti-racist advocacy work within the scope of our organizations. Within the scope of your organization's missions and activities. For example, if making a public statement, we ask that the organizations that affiliated to CARI that they will make sure to incorporate policy points related to racism and immigration, and make sure that it is a part of every conversation and discussed at every table. We hope and we want to push that this work, as others have said, is very, very crucial because it will be able to amplify what we are already doing. And we ask that all immigrants impacted by systemic racism be focused. And that, our hope is that CARI would be a complementary force in advocacy spaces, bringing the issues of racism and the angle of racism into the conversation, calling it out, and then providing the opportunity to stem and mitigate and finally eradicate racism. One of our first projects was the TPS for Cameroon. We were very happy to support our Black immigrant organizations to make sure that there was TPS for Cameroon, and we leveraged a lot of Catholic connections there to do that in the government. We hope that going forward, we hope to partner with many more Catholic organizations and secular organizations to make sure that we are addressing systemic racism both in the US immigration system. Because all of us can make sure that racism in immigration is not left out of important conversations. And we can always look for more ways to be collaborative and to support directly impacted people and communities. As we work hard and we look forward to working with all of you. And so if you see a space where there's a strong Catholic voice needed, please do reach out to us. We are focused, especially in both immigration law and practice, to ensure that by calling out racism, we can change the narrative and we can change our perceptions, and that way change the laws as well as the practices so that we can truly be a united states. Thank you.
Thank you, Renette, for sharing your vast knowledge of and your personal experiences with our broken, racist, outdated immigration system. The work that you are doing and also the advocates who are working with you and Kari and others around the country are doing great work to ensure that immigrants who come to this country are able to establish themselves and to build lives for themselves and for their families. Well, thank you to all of our excellent expert speakers this morning. We really appreciate you sharing your insights, your experiences, your cautions and observations. Each of you have talked in some detail about the flaws of our U.S. immigration system and policies. Previously, I posed a couple of questions to you and was hoping that we would have enough time to delve into each of these questions. But given that our time is a little short, I'm just going to ask one question and ask any of you to respond to that question if you have some input that you'd like to share. What are one or two changes that you think could or should be made to fix our current immigration system to be more equitable and more fair for immigrants of color?
I'd love to respond to that question. Thank you. Well, there are two immediate things that come to mind. One is a much more significant flaw that has really set the foundation for the government abuses of discretion against immigrants of color, and that's the plenary power doctrine. And in the earliest Supreme Court cases determining the constitutionality of immigration exclusionary laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Supreme Court declared extra constitutional powers and conferred those to the Congress and the executive, the political branches of the government, with complete deference and with little to no judicial review for immigration policies and practices that the political branches determined at any given time appropriate for the regulation of immigrants at the border and in this country. And the expansion of that Supreme Court jurisprudence edified a plenary power doctrine that also permitted the government to deport non-citizens, even those who have been residing here peacefully for years and years. And that plenary power doctrine remains good law. Those early Supreme Court cases have never been repealed. And once again, in spite of the Constitution having zero explicit enumerated powers that are conferred to the political branches to exercise that much authority over immigration matters. A much smaller step would be something that virtually all of the Democratic presidential candidates during the primaries in 2020 advocated, which was the repeal of these bars to reentry for unlawful presence, and also the crime, the repeal of the crime of illegal entry and illegal reentry. Those crimes constitute the majority of federal prosecutions in the country. So the majority of federal prosecutions are actually at the border. And in addition to deporting individuals who are entering without authorization, either for the first time or re-entering after being removed, those individuals are subject to criminal charges, and the federal government continues to vigorously pursue those prosecutions.
I can quickly also just add something, if that's okay. So very quickly, to answer your question, I think the easiest and the biggest way that we can change our immigration system is to mitigate racism, is to end the focus on enforcement only, but to move to a focus of an immigration system that has at its core the duty of care, and where we see the humanity of the immigrant in the same way in the model that when we accept Ukrainian immigrants. That's the way I would think we can easily change our immigration system.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for expanding our understanding of the role of racism in U.S. immigration policy, practices, and institutions. At the end of the day, we know that we have a broken system here, and that the cause of it in great detail is the issue of racism, which this country has yet to confront. We must do better as a country, and we as Catholics must do better. Our faith calls us to confront this sinful situation, to admit our own fault in it, and to take concrete steps to reverse this harm now. For the time is now to make and be the change that we need. I'd like to end our time together with going back to something that Pope Francis said in his 2021 trip to the island of Lesbos. He said, and I quote, "I am thinking of those who in recent years and still today have been fleeing from war and poverty, landing on the shores of the continent and elsewhere, and encountering not hospitality, but hostility and even exploitation. They are our brothers and sisters," unquote. And as our brothers and sisters, we must welcome them. We must treat them as we do our own. And we must bring them into the family of God, to the whole human family, and build together a future of justice and peace, ensuring that no one is left behind. Thank you for being with us this morning or this afternoon. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference. I wish you well. And thank you again to all of our panelists.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks so much to all of you for being here with us this afternoon, those of you that are here in person, as well as those of you joining us virtually. My name is Drew Kim. I'm the director of the Center for Advancement of the Humanities and also an associate professor of theology here at Marquette. I'd like to begin by extending my gratitude to the Center for Peacemaking, as well as the Center for Migration Studies in New York for helping arrange this important event. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation this afternoon. A couple of real technical notes before I get started. We will have a time for Q&A at the end of the talk. We'll have about 20 minutes, both for questions for those here with us in the audience, as well as those joining virtually. So ask that as you listen to our panelists, you think about questions you might have for them. I don't want to spend too much more time before jumping right into this important conversation we have today about belonging and identity, especially for immigrant populations in the Midwest. And so I want to thank most sincerely our panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to be here today. So I'll start by introducing them. First, on our left here, we have Jorge Montiel. Jorge is a PhD candidate here at Marquette. He specializes in Latinx and Latin American philosophy, decolonial philosophy, critical race theory, and phenomenology. Some of Montiel's publications include Aztec Metaphysics, Two Interpretations of an Evanescent World, and The Social and Political Philosophy of Jorge Portilla. Montiel's dissertation offers a phenomenological analysis of mestizaje as a historical liberatory project in mid-20th century Latin American philosophy. Next, here to my right, we have Sergio Gonzalez, who's an assistant professor of Latinx studies, also here at Marquette. Sergio is a professor he's in the Department of History as well as Language, Literature, and Cultures. He's a historian of 20th century US immigration, labor, and religion. His scholarship focuses on the development of Latino communities in the US Midwest. His first book, Mexicans in Wisconsin, offered a concise introductory history of Mexican settlement and community formation across the state. His current project, Strangers No Longer, Latino Belonging and Faith in 20th Century Wisconsin, explores the relationship between religiosity, Latino communities, and social justice movements in 20th century Wisconsin. Gonzalez extends his academic scholarship into his service commitments by serving on the executive boards of organizations such as the Labor and Working Class History Association, the Immigrant and Ethnic History Society, the Wisconsin Labor History Society, and State of Wisconsin Historic Preservation Review Board. A scholar activist at heart, he's also served as a co-founder and lead organizer for the Dane Sanctuary Coalition and as a board member of Voces de la Frontera, Wisconsin's largest and most active membership-based immigrant and worker justice organization. Speaking of voices, it's my extreme pleasure to have next to me on the left, Christine Newman Ortiz, who is the founder and executive director of Voces de la Frontera, a statewide member-led immigrant and worker rights organization. Newman Ortiz is the daughter of immigrants and is recognized as a national leader in the immigrants' rights movement. In August 2020, USA Today nominated Newman Ortiz as one of 10 women of the century for the state of Wisconsin to mark the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, when women gained the right to vote. In 2012, Ms. Newman Ortiz was named by the Huffington Post in the list of 50 young progressive activists who are changing America. Ms. Newman Ortiz has received numerous awards, including the Community Change Champion Award for Community Organizing and Leadership from the Center for Community Change and the Equal Justice Medal by Legal Aid Society of Milwaukee. Through her leadership, Voces has grown from a small grassroots worker center to a state and national leader in the immigrant rights movements. In 2016, The Nation magazine awarded Voces for Most Valuable Strategy in honor of the February 18th Day Without Latino and AMP, Immigrants' Statewide General Strike, which defeated a state anti-sanctuary bill. In 2012, The Nation named Voces the most valuable grassroots organization in the country. In 2009, the Wisconsin State Assembly recognized Voces for its role in achieving passage of in-state tuition rights for immigrant students as part of the 2009 to 2011 state budget. Ms. Newman-Ortiz earned her master's degree in U.S. Chicano history at the University of Texas, Austin, and her Bachelor of Arts degree in English at the University of Wisconsin, Madison.
Wisconsin,
So,
Madison.
warm welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you all for being here. Our first, yes, please. First, our structure here, we're gonna have one round of questions for each panelist that'll go about 10 minutes each, a second round and for about 5 minutes each, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. Our first question goes to you, Sergio, and the question is, can you provide us with the historical context of Latino settlement in Wisconsin, and maybe also speak to the historical amnesia we have around this topic?
Thank you, Drew, and thank you everyone for being here. I always relish the opportunity to break down some of these artificial barriers that exist between the academy and the places the academy calls home. And so it's a real pleasure to share space with my three co-panelists here. What I want to do is quickly walk you through a little bit of the work that I've been doing since I started graduate school in 2012, which is really a history of Latinos in Wisconsin, not the history of Latinos in Wisconsin. And I'll emphasize that some of the stories I want to share with you to start our conversation today are just a few of many of the family histories that make up the rich tapestry of Latino settlements across our state. I want to start by showing you an image, if that's all right. And it's an image actually of the first object that I ever pulled out of the archives as a graduate student. It's 2013, the summer of 2013, just finished up my first year of master's at UW-Madison. I came to the Milwaukee County Historical Society, and I said to the archivist that I was interested in writing a history of Latinos in the state. My family is from Jalisco, Mexico. Both of my parents settled here at different times in the 20th century. And I wanted to know why it was that my parents had decided to come here of all places instead of Texas or Arizona, California, somewhere with larger Mexican and Latino populations. So I said to the archivist, give me everything that you have. And the archivist went into the back room, and I was expecting for him to come out, of course, with boxes and boxes of materials, personal papers, institutional documents, oral histories, photos. And he came back out with 3 boxes, put them on the table, and said, good luck. That was it, 3 boxes. That was all the Milwaukee County Historical Society had preserved on my community's history. And I was obviously pretty disappointed because I thought this is not only going to be a very short dissertation, there's no way I'm going to get this done, right? I opened up the box though, and the first document I pulled out was this one. So take a look at that. Some audience participation to get us started here. What do you guys see in this image? Bautismo, so perhaps a baptism, what else? Just general observations, nothing too deep. What else you see? Family, Baby, how about the expression on the people's faces? Happy, joy, enthusiasm, right? Yeah. All right, folks, so this image is a picture of me in my parents' arms, walking out of church on a Sunday morning. A very surreal moment, existential, kind of like finding myself in the archives on my first trip. So I knew I was doing the right thing with my life. I was on the right path. So that's me. I'm just a few months old. I was born in April, so I'm just a baby here. It's my mom and my dad and some of my tias behind us. We are walking out of a church, not a baptism, just any Sunday of the year in July. And I was as well drawn to the joy on their faces. And I got to thinking, if you look at the bottom of the screen there, if I can have my clicker works here. Yeah, so it says the pulse of Hispanic Milwaukee. I got to thinking, what does it mean that the Milwaukee Journal, the newspaper of record for the state of Milwaukee, says that the pulse of this community are families walking out of a church on Sunday morning, right? Showing this sense of familial connection, this fellowship, and a sense of joy. And this image completely restructured the way I was going to think about my work, which was to think about religious spaces, not just churches, but also faith institutions like social agencies, as places where Latinos throughout the 20th century have built a sense of community. But they haven't just been, as my research has shown, places of respite, right? They haven't just been places where people have drawn back to when they have faced exploitation or discrimination in the work site or across communities. Churches and faith spaces have also been places where Latinos have armored themselves, or they've organized themselves, or they developed solidarity, not just within the community, but also with other ethnic and racial groups in the state of Wisconsin. And so the work that I've been looking at over the last few years focuses on places like Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is really the beating heart of Mexican Catholicism, not just in Milwaukee, but across Wisconsin. And I'm fundamentally interested in this question of how faith has been foundational in shaping the experiences of Latinos in places like Milwaukee, across Wisconsin, really across the Midwest as well. And so I'm interested in of how these churches have been places of fellowship, but also how they've offered them the language and the moral grounding to develop social movements, right? To not only prepare themselves to go out into the world and to demand full acceptance in their communities in the sense of full dignity in the places they call home, but to do so through a shared language with other communities in the state of Wisconsin. And so I'm interested in this question here of how churches have been places that have served as locations for interethnic collaboration, for withstanding prejudice and social alienation, for providing sanctuary from nativism and xenophobia, and for building a sense of transnational community formation, right? Because of course the church recognizes no borders, and so how does the faith travel across these artificial borders that exist in people's lives? And so really quickly, Drew, I'm hoping you can kind of hold me to it, because I could talk about this for hours. So I want to walk you through a very quick jaunt of this history, right? And talk about the history of Latinos in the state of Wisconsin and how those religious spaces have been those places of community formation. Latinos first began to arrive in Wisconsin in the 1920s. They were recruited here as agricultural and industrial workers. And they were brought here specifically to do the work that European descent immigrants had done before them. But when Congress passed a series of laws that functionally shut off immigration from Europe, Mexicans became the new lowest paid workers that were filling these positions. They arrived in a city that certainly needed them for their work, but did not want them to be a physical presence in their city streets and in their community spaces. And so they were often locked out of the immigrant institutions that had been open to German and Polish Americans. Of course, Milwaukee and Wisconsin through much of the 19th and early 20th century was known as one of the most immigrant heavy and immigrant friendly locations in the United States, right? It was known in the late 19th century as the Deutsche Athens of America because of its large German American population. Those type of opportunities, however, were not available to Mexican immigrants who arrived here. It was the church in the 1920s that was the space where Mexicans found a space that they could call home. And it was also a space where they could develop a sense of inter-ethnic Catholicism with their white co-ethnics on the south side. The Milwaukee Archdiocese in 1926 worked with a local Mexican community to purchase an old storefront on 5th and National. That building is still there. You can see it on 5th and National and Walker's Point here in Milwaukee. And the Mexicans of Milwaukee transformed that space into a place where they could practice their religion, where they could track geopolitical events happening in Mexico in the 1926 to the early 1930s. There was a pretty traumatic revolutionary war that was happening between the Mexican state and the Catholic Church, and so known as the Cristero Revolt or Cristero Revolution. And so Mexican Catholics here followed the status of what was happening back home in that space. In the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, ethnic Mexicans began arriving across the state of Wisconsin. These people were not arriving directly from Mexico. They were coming from Texas. So Texas Mexicans or Tejanos who were arriving every single year to work all across the state in every single agricultural production that you can imagine. So the cherry industry, the cucumber industry, sugar beets, potatoes, snap peas, corn, everything that was grown in Wisconsin was being picked by ethnic Mexican hands. These Texas Mexican families accounted for about 15,000 Tejanos arrived every single year in the harvest season to pick across the state of Wisconsin. And as you can imagine, those of you familiar with the history of migrant workers across the United States, their working and living conditions were pretty horrific. This is actually a pretty decent house that they may have found because at least it had a roof and it had windows. But many Tejano families ended up living in repurposed World War II barracks, and their living conditions were pretty sparse. Catholic and Protestant churches, I just want to really quickly point to, they often faced quite a bit of discrimination, segregation in places like Door County in northern Wisconsin. They were completely excluded from the resort towns. They were seen as kind of a racial other. But the state institutions were very worried that bad treatment of Tejano workers was going to have some pretty significant ramifications for the state's ability to recruit migrant workers to the state. And so in the 1950s, a number of institutions stepped forward and said that the state had to do a better job of being better neighbors to these newcomers. So this is a very specific example from the Milwaukee Sentinel in 1952. In 1952, the editorial board for the Milwaukee Sentinel argued that migrant crews which swarm into Wisconsin by the thousands are an economic asset to the state and make the difference between success and failure in many of our harvesting operations. They give us valuable service and deserve decent treatment while they are giving it. In other words, these were essential workers of the 1950s, and the state depended on these people to do the work. The point that I want to point out here, though, is that bolded section at the bottom, right? This kind of bit of rhetoric that the Milwaukee Sentinel is engaging in. They give us valuable service and deserve decent treatment while they are giving it. And of course, any of us should think of the inverse of that sentence. What happens when these Mexicans no longer provide a valuable service? How should the state treat these people? And the reality is that, of course, a lot of Latinos who arrived in Wisconsin as economic migrants faced that type of rhetoric, that as long as they provided a valuable service, they deserved decent treatment. But if they didn't, perhaps a different treatment was deserving for them. Catholic and Protestants also, unfortunately, in the 1950s and 60s approached these Tejano migrants from that sense of kind of a reciprocal relationship, that there was something to be had if they engage with these populations. And so in the 1950s and 1960s, Catholics and Protestants competed over the souls of Tejano migrants living across the state of Wisconsin. This is one of my favorite images from my archives. This is the Wisconsin Council of Churches and their migrant ministry. They used to ride around in a station wagon supplied by the National Council of Churches. It was called a harvester. And the harvester had, of course, play on words there in two different ways. They were working with harvesters, working in the fields, but they were also out there harvesting souls for the Protestant faith. And so Catholics and Protestants competed over the spiritual welfare and their spiritual allegiance to their churches, and oftentimes at the expense of actually helping the material well-being of these people, right? So their primary goal in working with migrants in the 50s and 60s is often spiritual and not material. You see here in 1967, a nun working here with migrants working in Milwaukee as migrants began to leave the fields. By the 1960s and 1970s, Latinos across the state of Wisconsin, which were going to be a sizable majority, were pretty fed up with kind of the church's stance towards these incoming Latino migrants and immigrants, and they demanded more. They demanded more than just spiritual services. They wanted physical support, and they wanted the priests and the nuns that were working with them to address the economic underpinnings that made their lives secondary in a place like Wisconsin, right? So this is from La Guardia, which was a radical Chicano newspaper here in Milwaukee in the 1960s and 1970s. Catholic leaders recognize Chicanos, but they tend to see us as a problem. And oftentimes it took migrant leaders and Latinos, Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans to organize themselves. Sometimes churches were a part of these organizing strategies, and sometimes they were not. This is one of the most dramatic examples. 1966, migrant farm workers organizing a strike in Watoma, call themselves Obreros Unidos, Wisconsin's first labor union. Point out three images. You see the Thunderbird, right? The image of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the farm workers in California. You see the American flag as these Texas Mexicans are claiming their right as American citizens. And then, of course, you see La Virgen de Guadalupe, right? That kind of ubiquitous image of Catholic Mexicans as well. And you see here these what I would refer to as radical priests that saw part of their charge in the years after Vatican II as working amongst these social movements. This is at St. Patrick's Church here on the south side, as priests like Father John Maurice organized basically coalitional support work to work alongside these social movements. This was a boycott Thanksgiving Mass held in support of the farm workers that were in boycott in California, organizing in California. You have Father Maurice up there, and you see next to him some of the labor leaders. And of course, in the sign, just imagine the sanctuary being filled with the social movement energy and the imagery as well. The last thing I want to point to, my work ends with the sanctuary movement of the 1980s. As hundreds of thousands of Central Americans fled places like Guatemala, El Salvador, fleeing political revolution and just terrible violence, they moved northward to places like Mexico, the United States, and Canada, seeking political asylum. When they arrived in the United States, the US government often denied them that human right to apply for asylum. And so it was often Protestant and Catholic churches that opened up their doors as places of safe harbor. That movement started in places like Arizona and San Francisco, but just a few months after the movement started and the borderlands, it had spread to Milwaukee. By December of 1982, Milwaukee had the first public Catholic sanctuaries in the country. Milwaukee also became home to the first, you see here a map of all the sanctuary churches in 1986 at the height of the movement. So you see the majority of the sanctuary churches were down here in the bottom, but the Midwest also had a sizable presence. Wisconsin with 16 sanctuary congregations by the mid-1980s. So I mentioned Milwaukee had the first Catholic sanctuaries. It also had the first Black sanctuaries in the United States and the first Jewish synagogues that joined the movement. And so it was these churches that stepped forward and tried to live out the full breadth of hospitality that should be offered according to Scripture to the newcomer arriving at the door, regardless of why they were knocking on the door to begin with. And I think I'll leave it there and just note that this history obviously has a continuing resonance, right? It's not just something that lives in the past, but something that we need to think about the future. In a place like Wisconsin, as Latinos now account for the largest minority population in the state, according to the last census, now over probably close to 500,000 Latinos, if we think about the census being an undercount, living across the state. And if you look at this map, Latinos now don't just reside in Southeast Wisconsin, they're all over the state, and their growth has happened in all parts of the state. And in fact, some of their most rapid growth is happening in places where Latino communities have historically never lived, like in the northern parts and up along the Mississippi on the western edge with Minnesota. So I think I'll leave it there. I'll leave with this image, which I think is a good segue to Christine's work. This is an image of the collaboration that has happened over the last few years between immigrant organizations, social justice movements, and churches, and the way in which words like sanctuary are being repurposed for new ways in the 21st century.
Thank you so much, Sergio. And that is a good transition to your question, Christine, which is, could you speak to contemporary work being done in the area of empowerment and the principles that further empowerment with reference to, for example, the new sanctuary movement and EWRN?
That was a lovely introduction. Thank you, Sergio. Yeah, for Voces, maybe just to add a little bit to the introduction for folks that are not familiar, is a member-led organization. And, part of the introduction also referenced the Day Without Latinx and Immigrants, which is a statewide general strike. Voces is unique, and here in Wisconsin, we're unique in that we've had the capacity to continue to draw on this collective struggle as a form of defense in beating back state anti-sanctuary bills, beating back a program called 287G in Milwaukee County in 2017. And it's basically where people have gone, left their jobs, with the danger of retaliation, have taken their kids out of school. So I mentioned that just to say that, tens of thousands of people have consistently been participating at critical moments in the struggle as a form of defense. And so, and then another way that we have organized over the years, so I just want to say that continues to be something that we continue to lean into when needed, which is how can we use that economic power? One of our members likes to say, they don't want us, but they need us. And the Day Without Latinos and Immigrants is about using the power you have to be respected. And if you don't have the right to vote because you're denied that, because you're denied a path to citizenship, the labor power that continues to be critical, 80% of undocumented immigrants, for example, are holding up our dairy industry. But it cuts across all kinds of industries, right? And so that's been one way that we've been organizing. And another way has been based on the empowerment of the Latino community and multiracial youth voters through Voceros por el Voto, which is really
tens of thousands of them
being
into the
a
country,
network
which
of
was
people
fantastic.
to
Nobody
inform
thought he could do
about
it in the time frame
elections,
that he
help
did.
people
He did it.
register. And we all know the
welcome has been
dramatic
thrown open
changes
to
we've seen
Ukrainian
in the
refugees.
election
But the fact
process
is, Canada
that are
gets to
constantly
pick and
happening and are
choose.
confusing to people. Critical. And we actually now have the largest in the country and one of the largest in the, or it is the largest in Wisconsin and one of the largest in the country of this Latino network of over 20,000. And so that's been a way to empower the community that needs that help because it's a working class community and often just doesn't have the time to be informed. And then I'd say the third area has been through broad community organizing. One expression of that is in the schools through our youth program, Youth Empowered in the Struggle, which we are, one exists here in Wisconsin. And also that has really led on the fight for education. And for example, this picture right here is under the Trump administration. As if you all remember, Jeff Sessions, one of the things that they did is they were trying to force, public government at all levels to come to these, especially city, to come to these agreements where they would essentially be an arm of immigration or have their federal funding pulled. That's a big threat. And fortunately, thank goodness, there was such broad resistance to this. And it found expression through sanctuary policies where basically like people were standing up and upholding even existing rights in the face of that and challenge that. And ultimately, that did not move forward, as we know. But that was from MPS, which did pass it. And I think the other part has been around like churches. So Voces de la Frontera, especially at a period when there was an escalation on deportations under the Obama administration, who had come in on the promise of immigration reform. One of our, in the past, we used to just give people, here's a lawyer you can talk to. And we had a member who became very angry and said, I expect more from Voces. And out of that reaction, we really reflected on like what more we could do, because it was either these long-term fights, which we continue to fight for, like immigration reform, and then, like these immediate needs. And so out of that came the New Sanctuary movement, which was very connected to the faith movement around in what ways could we offer moral support, humanitarian aid. So one of the programs that came out of that is kind of being rebuilt post-pandemic is the ICE accompaniment, where we have people accompany immigrants to their court, which is a very, frightful situation. And or to, local court if they have, as we know here in Wisconsin, another big issue is the absence of driver's licenses for immigrants. We used to have that for decades here, and that was taken away under Real ID. And so that potentially, ICE still has the option to be in the court system and obviously has access to that data. And driving without a license, second offense in 3 years, becomes a state criminal charge. One of the big issues confronting us right now is that little known fact. In fact, I'm going to ask you right now, raise your hand if you have heard of this, that the US Supreme Court took away Biden's ability to prioritize immigration enforcement. If you heard of that, can you raise your hand? Okay, so yeah, I mean, it's a really big deal. It means that it does expose people, 11 million people, to deportation. Of course, presidents throughout time have had that ability. So it really shows that this is ideological, right? What's happening, it's not really based on, principles of law. And it's just a reality that we're living in right now. So the New Sanctuary movement was one way, past and present, that we're rebuilding up to really provide solidarity and support against a potential, someone being picked up in the courtroom or outside of it. And then the other thing that I would say is that that's transformed during the Trump administration. We did have our first case of sanctuary here at Ascension Lutheran Church, where there was someone who actually was taken into sanctuary. So that was our first real case. But we created kind of levels of sanctuary because people are at different places. And so there's different ways to be in solidarity. The big issue I would say right now is that in the face of the repeal of that, those enforcement protections, we also have something that's grown over time, which is the collaboration between immigration and the police. And we saw that escalate big under the Trump administration with a program called 287G that started with Bush, and was, because of movement pressure, was like kind of brought down under the Obama administration and has grown very, very big under Trump, has not yet been terminated under Biden. And in fact, through different federal grants, there's been kind of growth of those collaborations. What those programs do is number one, they legalize racial profiling. So if someone thinks, I think you could be undocumented, that's good enough. So of course, that's an attack on history of racial justice, civil rights organizing. Two, that it allows, basically local law enforcement in this voluntary program becomes deputized to be an ICE agent. So public safety is undermined because the priority is just to figure out, is this person undocumented, and to share that information with ICE and get that person deported, regardless of how many years they've lived here, regardless of, their ties, all of that. And the other way that it, creates fear is that people become very fearful of law enforcement. And so that means if you've been a victim of a crime or a witness, you're not going to want to participate in any way. So in places where you do have sanctuary policies, they're actually safer communities because especially if you're a vulnerable population, you are more, you can be prey to criminal action. So what I would say in terms of where we're at right now, there are some pictures that I wanted to show. Let's see, do I just click on it here? Okay. Okay. So what we consider a priority right now, and I put this up here because this was an action that we just recently did with Never Again Action. It's a progressive Jewish or national organization that has really responded to a modern day fascist threat through a Jewish experience and lens, to be in solidarity and to really put priority on challenging anyone, whether Republican, Democrat, any of these institutions that are not doing what we can to stand in solidarity to really beat back these kind of xenophobic racist policies. That is the House of Mallorcas. And so there was a peaceful civil disobedience action that we did. This was a paint art, and we had people who were providing testimony who are undocumented immigrants who at great personal risk in solidarity with others participated in this action. So I think one of the important things is that solidarity is protection in a very real way. And so this we consider right now, one of the priorities is to put pressure on the Biden administration. It was a campaign promise to end this program. There are 8 counties now in Wisconsin that have this program in effect. No transparency, no public input into when these agreements were signed. They were signed under the Trump administration, but now we have 30 counties where you have agreements, essentially the same thing, to share information with ICE. They're basically incentivizing federal grant money to these counties to participate at the expense of immigrants and our communities. And so that program is now in 30 counties. It's called the State Criminal Alien Program. And it's basically essentially a different version of 287G. So this thing has grown big under the radar screen, the deportation machinery. And so that's one area that we consider very important, executive action. And one that's hopeful is that last year we were short 1 vote in the Senate to pass immigration reform, which is a credit to the movement. And we consider that also very important, is participation in the election. So accountability, with folks that make promises, but also to make sure that people are informed on the platforms that people are running on, because we have seen the growth of now really this far right element in modern day politics that is a very serious threat to democracy, and certainly immigrants and refugees are a target of those actions. The other thing that we think we want to partner with in terms of faith organizations is the rebuilding of that solidarity program around, not that we have to house it all, but even in partnership, be able to provide more connections for people around humanitarian aid, the solidarity actions, and expanding asylum legal services. We have seen that grow throughout Wisconsin, and we've seen it used very cruelly, where the busing in of refugees with no plan, with no real support, just as a political stunt. And that's something that communities are grappling with right now, and where we see a need to stand up and hold candidates and elected officials accountable to the humanitarian crisis that is happening with refugees, and to really stand up for compassion and support, and showing those examples and doing more to receive people. So that, I think, would be considered, I think those would be the most urgent priorities of our time.
Thank you so much. Okay, next we have Jorge Montiel, and our question for you, Jorge, is we've been talking about themes of community, belonging, empowerment. And can you talk about your research specifically with regard to the literary movement that began in Chicago in the 90s, and maybe how that furthers these themes we've been discussing?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for being here. And it's an honor to be here with Sergio Gonzalez and Christine Newman-Ortiz. So I thought about dividing my participation in this panel into two broad sections. So first, I'm gonna talk about the Spanish literary movement in Chicago that began in the 1990s and to the present. And then I will offer a philosophical reflection about the themes of identity that emerged from this literary movement. So the first thing that I would like to do is to distinguish the literary movement in Chicago from the Chicano movement, Chicano literary movement. The Chicano literary movement, as some of you know, some of you may know, Chicanos are an ethnic identity. These are people, Mexican citizens living in former Mexican states such as California, Colorado, Texas, that later in the 19th century became part of the US. So the motto of Chicanos is, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And some of the main literary examples of this movement, of this literary movement, are US poet laureate Juan Felipe Herrera, Rodolfo Anaya, Carlos Compián, and perhaps most well-known Sandra Cisneros. The difference between this Chicano literary movement and the literary movement that I will be talking about in Chicago is that the Chicano literary movement uses primarily English as a means of communication, as a means of writing, and also that Chicanos trace their origins to the mythical place of Aztlán, which is an area in northern Mexico or southern US, from which the ancient Aztecs began their pilgrimage down to Mexico City, where they founded the Aztec Empire. In contrast, the literary movement in Chicago employs exclusively Spanish as a means of communication, as a means of writing. So all their literature is published in Spanish. And they also trace their cultural background, as they put it, to the language of Miguel Cervantes, who's the author of Don Quixote, Alfonsina Storni, who's a poet from Argentina, and Juan Rulfo, who is a writer from Mexico. So these are the main difference between the Chicano and literary movement and the Spanish literary movement in Chicago. So now let me talk briefly about the history of the Spanish literary movement in Chicago. In 2010, the Spanish literary and cultural magazine Contratiempo published this anthology called En la 18 a la 1, Escritores de Contratiempo in Chicago. So on 18th Street at 1 p.m., writers of Contratiempo in Chicago. And the reason I begin with this anthology is because the title allows us to situate this literary movement in space and time. By the way, I have to say, Contratiempo, this magazine, this literary magazine, we can translate Contratiempo as untimely. And that'll be important for my later exploration of some of the themes of identity that emerged from this movement. So 18th Street, or in the title of this anthology, 18th Street refers to the intersection in Chicago between 18th Street and Halsted Avenue in the neighborhood of Pilsen. Pilsen is a neighborhood that has been the entryway for many waves of migrants into Chicago. So we have Czech migrants, Polish migrants, and since the 1960s, Mexican migrants. And since the 1960s, Pilsen has become the cultural and political center of Mexican migration in Chicago. At 1 p.m. Is also important in the title of this anthology because it refers to the bi-weekly literary workshop that Contratiempo hosts since the inception of this movement in the 1990s. This workshop, this literary workshop, it has become basically the heart of this literary movement. As Peruvian literary critic, Julio Ortega writes in his prologue to the anthology, he says, Pilsen is a literary workshop, a Spanish literary workshop. So the contemporary Spanish literary movement in Chicago began in 1991 as a literary workshop, basically as a reading group among immigrants in Chicago. Febronio Satarain, one of the pioneers of this literary movement, writes that the first workshop was primarily a reading group of Latin American writers. In the dining room of a Pilsen apartment, we read Piedra de Sol by Octavio Paz, Los Funerales de Mamá Grande by Gabriel García Márquez, Batallas en el Desierto by José Emilio Pacheco, El Apando by José Revueltas, and El Llano en Llamas by Juan Rulfo, among many others. So this literary movement started as basically as a reading group. Among the pioneers of this literary movement are, and just to show you the diversity of Latin American voices that make up this movement, is Febronio Satarain, who I just mentioned, from Mexico, Raúl Dorantes, also from Mexico, José Uribe from Colombia, Ricardo Anaya from Nicaragua, Bernardo Navia from Chile, Carolina Franco from Colombia, Juana Gorgen from Puerto Rico, Eduardo Urios Aparici from Spain, and Graciela Reyes from Argentina. After 6 months of reading Latin American authors, this group began to think about a first publication. And that first publication is Fe de Ratas, or Errant's Sheet. It was published, this is the number 0, the first number, or the first issue of that magazine. It was a literary magazine, and it was published in May of 1992. And it was entitled this way, Errant's Sheet, or Errata Sheet, because the group conceived of itself as the product of a mistake. And in fact, I think Fe de Ratas is very important for tracing the origins of this literary movement because it serves as a manifesto. In this manifesto, they write the following: Spanish is our motherland, patria, our Latin American motherland. Our language is the feeling of an identity that is forced to respond to a foreign reality, to a foreign language, in this case, English, an identity that becomes snared within the silences imposed by the dominant language. Fe de Ratas aims to be precisely that, the recognition of an effort to correct the imposition of silence. So what we'll see throughout, or what I hope to show, is that this literary movement is not just talking about the experience of migration from a passive way, but how this literary movement shows the agency of these migrants. So Fe de Ratas was published from 1992 to 1995. It was a trimestral publication. There followed Zorros y Erizos, or Foxes and Head Dogs, from 1990. It was published only in 1997. Tropel, or Crowd, from 1998 to 1999. El Coyote, or Coyote, from 2001. And lastly, Contratiempo, which I translated as untimely, from 2003 to the present. Now, Contratiempo is, in my view, one of the most important Spanish cultural and literary magazines in the Midwest, and to be honest, in the country. It's a cultural and literary magazine published monthly. It's published both in print and online. It is the most long-lasting effort of this Spanish literary movement in Chicago. And it is the Spanish magazine with the greatest presence in the Midwest. Has published more than 150 issues. It also hosts the editorial house, Voces Sueltas, which has published in 2007, 7 volumes of poetry, narrative, and essay in Spanish, all in Spanish. So this is one of the publications. This it's called Desarraigos, Cuatro Poetas Latinoamericanos en Chicago, four Latin American poets in Chicago. In collaboration, this is also very important, I think, in collaboration with DePaul University, the University of Illinois in Chicago, and Northeastern Illinois University, which is my alma mater, the Poetry Foundation and the Cervantes Institute, Contratiempo organizes an annual poetry festival called Poesía en Abril to celebrate April as the International Month of Poetry. So every year since 2007, Poesía en Abril brings together more than 20 poets, including local Chicago poets, poets from other regions in the US, as well as poets from all over Latin America and Spain. So annually they publish a little anthology like this, collecting the poems of the participants in the Poesía en Abril festival. So here we have people, for example, from Spain, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Mexico, Chile, Mexico, Spain, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Peru, Cuba, Mexico, and United States, Peru, Puerto Rico, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Peru, Mexico, and the United States. So besides the Poetry Foundation, the Poetry Foundation based in Chicago is perhaps the most important magazine of poetry in the world. Besides the Poetry Foundation, Poesía en Abril is perhaps one of the most important promoters of poetry in the Midwest and one of the most important promoters of Spanish poetry in the country. So lastly, I would like to conclude this first intervention by exploring some of the themes. And I'm going to read a short story for you, one of my favorite short stories, and that I think also relates to the themes of labor that Sergio and Christine were talking about. As one may imagine, this literary movement is not homogeneous, and some of its themes, the themes that we find in the movement range from migration and labor, feminism, the exploration of sexuality, and the experience of migration in many, many ways. So this short story that I want to share with you is called One Day of Rambo, one of Rambo's days. And it's written by Stanislaw Jazorek. Stanislaw's story is actually very interesting because he's a Polish immigrant in Chicago who learned Spanish before he learned English, and has become a very important part of this literary movement. So the short story says, that day, Rambo stayed at the McDonald's. He was dying in cold, but he had no alternative. He owed his part in rent, and no one wanted to lend him money for that day's breakfast. The group of workers outside of Home Depot looked at him with indifference, like one would look at a wounded animal that is about to fall. The morning cold hit him ruthlessly. It was 8 a.m. It was 8 in the morning, but just like yesterday, he was out of luck. Since 6, the trucks began picking up some of the day laborers, but not him. While the group warmed up with some coffee, he decided to take the risk, and he stood up by the stop sign. His boots were still wet from the snow of the previous day. So as to forget about the cold, he reminisced about his hometown. He remembered his farewell party the day he left to cross the border. There were his siblings, his mother, and his cousin Ellie. His mom had prepared him some tamales and champurrado, but he didn't want to eat. He was excited to move to the north. He didn't notice when, behind him, a truck stopped and a voice called his attention. Hey, you! Rambo turned around and saw the head of a fat gringo. Yes? You saber trabajar? Yes, I work hard. What's your name? My name is Tony, Rambo replied. Get in, the gringo shouted. Suddenly, the man felt that his luck was coming back. A day of work means food for several days, and he would be able to pay the 50 pesos that he owed in rent. The job was inside. It was an old bungalow with walls that had been scraping off for years. It was a matter of demolishing them and taking out the rubble. Rambo took off his coat and his rag sweatshirt to start working. When he saw the naked chest, the boss said, "You look like Rambo." That's how they called me, Rambo. As the drywall fell, the dust covered the air and the fat man began asphyxiating. "Fucking shit," said the gringo as he left the room. There was no heat, but Rambo was sweating a lot. He liked working hard, working fast, working without rest. That way he forgot about the rest of the world. He liked to work so as not to think. He believed that those who think too much end up suicidal. He avoided those moments of loneliness that populated his head with random thoughts. But he couldn't stop thinking about the recession. Good thing I don't have kids, Rambo told himself as he thought about the other workers' families. Now he was poorer than ever before, his leaving his hometown. In the wallet, he only carried his consulate ID. The only thing I have is my mother's blessing. Maybe I was born to be poor. At the end of the day, he finished the job and felt a calming tiredness. The gringo delivered him to the same parking lot where he had picked him up that morning. He pulled out a check and wrote the amount of $100. Your name? No check, only cash, please. I have no cash. I'm working hard. You pay, the worker responded. When he saw that the situation was getting difficult, the gringo pulled out a police badge. I am police, he said. Rambo got close to the badge. It read Chicago Police Department. Then he felt the man putting a bill in his hand. It was a $20 bill. Now you go. After getting off the truck, Rambo went to talk to the cow, another worker from the state of Guerrero. Oh man, that gringo never pays. Assholes, why didn't you say anything? You were already on top of the truck. Rambo gave him an empty look. He turned around and walked away with quick steps. For a moment, his muscular body was seen crossing Cicero Avenue. After that, he got lost in the twilight of winter. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so thank you so much to our panelists. I think in the interest of time here, to make sure that we still have a sufficient time for the Q&A, we did have budgeted 5-minute second round. We'll maybe make it much shorter into like 1 to 2. How does that sound? So that should be no problem at all, right? And I'll try to make the question a little bit smaller too. So returning back to you, Sergio. You talked towards the end of the first round about the kind of continuing resonance of this work today. And so I wonder if you could maybe expand on what are some of the contemporary challenges now that religious communities face in trying to continue the historical work that's been done.
Well, I think Christine pointed out some of the ways in which the contemporary sanctuary movement has continued the work of the 1980s. And so, of course, there are important distinctions to be made between the historical movement of the 80s and the one of today. The most important one, I think, is the fact that in the 1980s, the religious organizations and churches and synagogues were confronting a very immediate humanitarian crisis that was occurring, right? And that the people who were arriving were in fact new arrivals to the United States from El Salvador and Guatemala. Today, the faith institutions are often interacting and trying to offer solidarity to people who have lived in this country for decades. And so the question here becomes now, how is it not a question of offering aid to the newcomer, but offering aid to the neighbor who has always lived beside us? So I think some of the work that religious organizations, and specifically those who are engaged in the solidarity work and social movements, have to do is to recognize the way in which they have often ignored or not paid attention to communities that have lived right next to them for quite some time. And so I don't really have a definite answer to that, but I think that's something that we have to continue to grapple with. There are obviously instances where individual parishes and some organizations have been doing this work for quite some time. And in fact, some of the parishes that are engaged in the new sanctuary movement today can trace their lineage of this work up until the 1980s or even perhaps before that. But many of the new movements that are engaged in, or many of the new churches that are engaged in this work have a lot of just really shovel work to do. When I was a graduate student in Madison during the Trump administration, I was part of a group that was restarting the sanctuary movement in the city. And I would speak to different churches and synagogues every single week. And to be quite honest, it was people who had never even thought about immigrants or refugees who were living in their midst in the city, that were people who had lived in the city for decades. And so I think that's going to be the difficult work that continues moving forward.
Thanks so much, Sergio. And my question for you, Christine, is in your work partnering with religious communities and institutions, what would you say it is that religious communities most have to offer to help in that work of empowerment that you were discussing earlier in community organization?
I think that they already are within institutions that, really center their values, regardless of kind of like the politics around it. I think that's very powerful. I think there's been a lot of humanitarian support, but I think continuing to form partnerships, whether that's here in Wisconsin or elsewhere, I think, creating strategic partnerships too with immigrant-led organizations, I think is very important. And to continue to in some way move forward, right, from where we are. But, the one thing in the previous presentation that I felt like I missed is that it is so important. The concept of self-determination is so important and powerful that it's not from a position of charity. The sanctuary movement of the 80s was, an alliance, very, very powerful, courageous alliance. And we need to be powerful and courageous and be a voice for compassion over the forces of hate. So I think the times are urgent. We need to act. And I would encourage everyone to really to act in some way, move forward, but really from the concept of solidarity and recognizing the self-determination of immigrants and refugees themselves.
Thank you so much. On the question of self-determination, you hosted a collaborative last semester on narrative identities of the self or narrative approaches to the self. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, maybe in this summing up here, about ways that what you were just talking about, poetry, narrative, and so forth, can play a role in empowerment.
So for this part of the my intervention, I was planning to give sort of a philosophical reflection, but I'm going to skip that because it gets too abstract. So instead, I think that one of the things that recaptures me about this movement, this literary movement, is that they claim Spanish to be their patria, their motherland. And Julio Ortega, in the anthology I was describing before, writes, for example, Pilsen is not only a neighborhood in Chicago made into a Mexican neighborhood within the broader map of Latin American migration in the US, rather it is, to my own surprise, a town situated in time, which has a life of its own, almost independently of the urban expansionism that threatened to modernize it. I mean to say that Pilsen is situated in a Mexican time, outside the time of late capitalism's urban development. So the kinds of claims these people are making is to say that immigrants are constituting their own space and time, their own sort of cultural world, thinking from the phenomenological tradition. So I'm going to skip the philosophical reflection, which has to do with how phenomenologists think about experiential time and how we think about tradition and how tradition informs the way in which we interact with the world. And instead, I want to read a poem because I really think this poem captures sort of this construction of a world for immigrants using Spanish as the means of constructing a world. So this poem is by Cuban poet Jorge. Oh my gosh. Jorge Luis García de la Fe. Sorry about that. And it's entitled Chicago es mi batey, or Chicago is my batey. This batey is a Taino word that refers to a neighborhood where the houses of slaves in the Caribbean who worked in sugarcane fields were located. So bateys are neighborhoods of slaves who worked in sugarcane fields. So Chicago is my batey. Matanzas is a city in Cuba. So Matanzas and Chicago are embroiled in me. They're a mixture of rivers, bridges, and streetlights. I walk towards this realm where time unifies in a continuum. My compass becomes delirious. I do not know if latitude is remoteness, if longitude is closeness. At night, all shapes are dull. Two cities collapsing within my pupils like a hallucination. And so I leave beloved parts of myself along the way. The finger, the throat, what I was just thinking, the ear, my will, my sexual preferences, even the poem I wrote for you in December. Why did I come to this city that I never left? If each corner is an anecdote on my skin, and when I pass, I will have given myself with all my existences. What day will follow this? Today, I'm a stranger to myself. What week, what minute would come to give me back the pleasure that would make me agonize, like a moaning word taken in silence? Yesterday, I saw you in the mirror behind that glass. You had grown wings, looking like a beautiful wingless animal. I, on the other hand, feel so dense that I avoid the hospital scales. Tomorrow I will go out looking for you again, almost hopeful, almost inattentive. I do not want this city, despite its rivers, its bridges, its streetlights, to realize how close to Matanzas it is to me. It could, in all fairness, accuse me of being ungrateful. She doesn't know that I begin to enjoy its ghostly fog. It does not imagine that I brought you against your will, like a painful memory, just to see you appear again in random faces, in each familiar gesture. And I stayed silent and I consented. And I smiled and thought, how the hell will others understand that Chicago is my batey? So I think what this poem does is that it unfolds the self. It's an unfolding of the self where the poet walks around and sees himself both as an immigrant, but also as inhabiting his old city of Matanzas in Cuba. And so the poem is sort of the reencountering and the missing out of the poem with the self. And I think this is kind of the experience that, or the experience of identity that this literary movement in Chicago from the 1990s to the present are contending with.
Okay, thanks so much, Jorge. So we are a bit over time, but I think we still do have questions, time for a couple questions. So if you have a question in person, please come up to the mic. I would just ask that you make sure to speak into the mic, because if you don't, those of us joining us online won't be able to hear you. So go ahead and make your way up here if you have a question. And then also for those of you joining us virtually, go ahead and put a question in the chat and we'll maybe have time to get to one of yours as well.
Thank you to each of the panelists for your presentations. Very informative. But this is a broad question to all three of you. You know, as we think about institutional churches and that seeing a decline in membership, and as well as really a fracturing along political lines and attitudes towards immigration. But I also heard how these coalitions, especially in Milwaukee, were made up of both the institution as well as, groups that were aligned with religious organizations. So how has that shifting landscape impacted your work, or, as you're writing about history, Cirio, what has that been when we think about it today?
Mhm. Well, I think for me, I would say that I mean, I know that a lot of our members, for example, are Catholic. And so for me, I think there is an urgency with the Catholic Church really, playing a more stronger active role in the struggle around immigration. And I know it does in many different ways, but I think given how important, that is, the home and the identity and, the connection for so many of our members, we did, and I hope we take this out, in a good way, the way I bring it up, but I think like in the sanctuary movement, under the Trump administration, we needed to, have more space and more participation. What we've seen is how that plays out, that, for example, maybe like the Capuchins have some, freedom. So it kind of, because there's different kind of policies in place. And so I guess that's all I'll say. I think, and we don't really get involved in kind of the internal workings of or those debates that are taking place. But I will say, for example, like with the Methodists, they're grappling with the question around LGBTQ rights. And, Voces, we believe in all of, those issues, because whether that's women's rights, LGBTQ rights, we believe on all of those issues because for working class people, and especially if you're someone without status or you're crossing the border and are vulnerable to, all kinds of violence, that kind of, respect for that individual is so important. So we don't really get so much into the internal workings of it, but I think there needs to be, so we basically end up working with whoever will work with us. I don't know if that's a good enough answer there, but yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, my work as a historian and also doing the work of Sanctuary in Madison was to continue to trouble the assumptions that we make about Latinos and their relationship to not just their faith, but to establish institutional religious organizations, right? And so, throughout the 20th century, the Catholic Church would continually make claims that because Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and Latinos in general were nominally Catholic, that they had a right to these people, right? And so they often took for granted the need to work to bring Latinos into churches, and not just for spiritual reasons, but also for questions of social action. I think today, unfortunately, we continue to see those assumptions being made by Catholic institutions at times, assuming that Latinos are going to show up. But of course, the landscape of religious identity has become much more diverse and complicated over the last 20, 30 years, as we've seen a growth of evangelical Latinos across the United States, including here in Milwaukee. And so I think in many ways, churches and religious institutions continue to need to work to bring Latinos into their spaces, not just for faith identities, but also for questions of social action obligations. And often this is going to come down to like the individual work that's being done by parishes and religious leaders. So, Christine brought up the way in which you have to just work with who comes to the table. And so in the 1980s, the Catholic Church was quite frankly pretty absent when it came to questions of advocacy for Central American migrants. The sanctuary movement was, in most places, a Protestant movement. Milwaukee was kind of an outlier in that the Catholic Archbishop Weekland granted his blessing to the movement, but most archbishops refused to become involved in sanctuary because they saw it as too much of a political matter. I think we've seen that change changed over the last 20, 30 years is more bishops are willing to take a more, what would be assumed by many people to be a more strident political stance for what they say is not a political issue, but a human rights issue, and in fact, a religious issue. And I think we need to continue to see more of that because it won't be then any surprise when young Latinos stop coming to churches, when they don't see them as spaces that are welcoming for them or as places that are home for them and their family.
So I'm going to defer to Jacqueline here. Do we have time for one from the chat or? No, not so much. Okay. And not seeing anybody at the mic, then I guess we're ready to wrap up. Can we have another hand for all of our panelists, please, for all of the information that they shared and for being here? And thank you also to all of you for joining us. Okay, we have a couple announcements for you before you go.
Hi, everybody. Just right now, after this session, we're going to be serving lunch in the Lynch Lounge, which is just outside of this room in the big area where you all did registration. Seating for lunch will be available in the Ballroom E, which is where we did the main sessions this morning, and on the veranda outside. So feel free to sit in either of those areas. And after lunch, we'll be hosting 2 simultaneous workshops again, which will begin at 1:45. Workshop 1, titled Taking the Right Not to Have to Migrate Seriously, Crafting a Holistic Catholic Response to the Causes of Forced Migration, will be held in Ballroom AB, on the other side of the main ballroom. And Workshop 2, entitled From Belief to Behavior, Promoting Immigrant-Friendly Parish Practices, will be held in this ballroom. So feel free to choose whichever one you'd like to attend and enjoy lunch, and we'll see you all at 1:45. Thanks.